Tonight I ordered a targeted military strike on the airfield in Syria from where the chemical attack was launched.
Bu müdahalesini biz yerinde buluyoruz ve destekliyoruz.
Celebrated and condemned. The American strikes on Syria have divided opinion both in the US and around the world. A barrage of missiles hit the regime airbase believed responsible for last week's Sarin gas attack. Those in favor of the strikes say they sent a message that using chemical weapons carries consequences. But was it a one-off slap on the wrist, or did it mark a seismic shift in US policy? Many supporters of President Donald Trump say they feel betrayed. If it's America first, then why bypass Congress to attack a foreign government, jeopardizing ties with its allies and risk American lives on the ground? And besides, Hillary Clinton was supposed to be the warmonger, not Trump. The outcry seems to have brought together opposing sides from across America's political chasm, with anti-war protesters saying the strikes risk escalating the conflict and drawing America further into the Syrian quagmire. Assad's allies say they'll retaliate against any future strikes. But the US says they are prepared to do more. Will these threats now be taken more seriously? The Syrian opposition certainly hopes so, as the rebels wonder if they found a willing ally. Our newsmaker today is the US missile strike, as we ask how this military action has recast the dice in Syria.
My fellow Americans, on Tuesday, Syrian dictator Bashar al-Assad launched a horrible chemical weapons attack on innocent civilians. Tonight I ordered a targeted military strike on the airfield in Syria from where the chemical attack was launched.
Less than 24 hours later, Syrian warplanes resumed bombing the area. But the US strike served as a warning to the Assad regime.
It was time to say enough. But not only say it, it was time to act.
The strike also distinguished President Trump from his predecessor, Barack Obama.
If we fail to act, the Assad regime will see no reason to stop using chemical weapons.
Who made an empty threat against the Assad regime after a chemical attack in 2013 in a Damascus suburb.
What you've seen in the last 48 hours is President Trump being more decisive than Obama was in the last 8 years.
Many in Washington now wonder if the first U.S. strike against the Assad regime will be the last.
It was planned as a one-strike mission, and depending on reaction, that's what I think the administration intends it to be, a one-strike mission.
If regime change, the removal of Assad now becomes the principal goal, that means young American men and women will be the boots on the ground.
I actually think a lot of Trump voters should probably be here tonight because they did not vote for an interventionist foreign policy, at least not in this way.
U.S. imperialist #1 terrorist!
Many in the U.S. are wary of repeating past mistakes overseas. Warnings that Trump, the candidate, made, which resonated with his base.
We went from mistakes in Iraq to Egypt to Libya to President Obama's line in the sand in Syria. Each of these actions have helped to throw the region into chaos and gave ISIS the space it needs to grow and prosper. Very bad.
After 6 years of war in Syria, with the U.S. on the sidelines, the country's security vacuum has sucked in a number of foreign fighters, militias, and armies, while the rules of war have been ignored. And as the world waits for the next move of a man that has touted the merits of unpredictability,
we are totally predictable.
Many of those trapped in the war can only hope that bold moves may change their state of constant duress. Randolph Noble, The Newsmakers.
Well, to unpack these issues, I'm joined in the studio by Yahya Al-Aridi. He's a spokesman for the Syrian political opposition, the High Negotiations Committee. In London, we have Major General Walter D. Given, formerly with the US Air Force. He's now a senior vice chancellor at Troy University. And in Baton Rouge, Louisiana, another US Air Force officer, retired Colonel Rob Maness. He's also a former candidate for the US Senate. And in Sochi, former Russian MP Sergei Markov. He's a member of Russia's Civic Chamber and the director of Moscow's Institute of Political Studies. Gentlemen, thanks all of you for joining us. Let me start with you, Colonel Rob Maness. Were these strikes a good idea?
Well, I think they were definitely not a good idea. It opened up a big debate that we thought we finished in 2013 when Barack Obama wanted to do the exact same strike under the exact same circumstances. The American people rose up through their representatives in Congress and said no. We were against these kind of intervention in Syria's civil war for this purpose by about 70% in those days, and I believe we still are. Atrocities are no reason to circumvent our Constitution. And militarily, it looks like it was not even barely a pinprick. Operations have already completed or began again from the air base within just a few hours. The runways and taxiways were not even touched.
Colonel, let me jump in there just for a second. You say,
that I saw,
my apologies, I know there's a delay as well. I know there's a delay as well, so my apologies. Let me jump in there. You say atrocities are no reason. So let me ask that question in another way. Should Assad be left to gas his people with sarin with no repercussions, and the U.S. doing nothing about it?
Absolutely not, but it's not just the United States' responsibility. He's violating the Chemical Weapons Convention, and everybody that's in the national security organizations in the United States understands that, and in the global security and community organizations such as the United Nations knows that. So no, he shouldn't get away with that, but absolutely the President of the United States should not circumvent the Constitution or the War Powers Act, whether you think that law is constitutional in our country or not, in order to take a singular action that intervenes in another country's civil war and really distracts us from the real war, which is fighting and defeating the Islamic State as rapidly as possible, like he promised that we would do. Okay,
let's bring in Major General Walter D. Given. So Rob Maness makes a good point, doesn't he? He said it's a pinprick. Those are the words he used. 59 Tomahawk missiles for 6 Syrian soldiers dead and basically weakening an air base. Do you think that was effective?
Well, I do think it served a purpose, and I think it was a measured response against an atrocity that didn't need to stand. We went against the place where the chemical weapons attacks were launched. We went with a significant capability, as you pointed out, 59 Tomahawks, 1,000-pound warheads. That's not insignificant. A significant amount of damage was done. Whether they're able to resume operations or not, the important thing is whether chemical attacks resume. And in this particular case, although there are always risk of escalation, I believe the strike was the appropriate thing to do and well within the executive powers of the president to do so.
Yahya Al-Aridi, I didn't think I'd be asking this question so soon into the Trump presidency, but does the Syrian opposition now fully support President Donald Trump?
Well, it's not a matter of supporting him or not supporting him, but we noticed that there is a divorce of the previous Obama policy towards Syria that has, we consider, resulted in all these atrocities and resulted in all these victims in Syria. Mr. Obama just alienated himself from the atrocities, although the United States considers itself to be the leader of the free world, to have responsibility towards what goes on in the world. And this is historically a fact. And many blame President Obama for just leaving a stain in the history of the United States when he didn't act to atrocities being carried out by a dictator. And this is the situation that has been historically done by other U.S. presidents. And when you claim to be the leader of the free world, when you claim to be the most powerful country in the world, and when you come with your elections under bringing America back to greatness, I think you should act. Now, this tragedy in Syria needs to stop, and there are responsibilities to be shouldered by those powers. We notice that Russia is just interfering in a form of mandate or occupation, and they have to stop. Iran is just creating chaos.
So let's take the Russia point and pose it to Rob Maness. Rob Maness, how much responsibility does Russia bear when it comes to this?
I think they bear huge responsibility, you know, and the path that I would have considered the best path in this situation is for President Trump and his ambassador, our ambassador Nikki Haley at the United Nations, and Secretary Tillerson to continue to engage the Russians as they began to, obviously, before the decision was taken, to launch the strike. You know, we have over 700 Americans on the ground in Syria, and it's arguable whether this strike did any good at all as far as deterring the Syrians from launching chemical attacks again. We'll see how that goes, but they definitely put at increased risk our American troops, because the first thing the Russians did was back out of the Combat Airspace Coordination Agreement, and that leaves our air forces and our ground forces blind as to what the Syrian and Russian Air Force is doing, and vice versa. They would now be blind to what we were doing, and that really increased the risk of a possible attack on American troops.
Walter, given a point that Rob Maness made earlier on was that he doesn't want the United States to take their eye off the ball with the ISIS or Daesh first policy, seeing them as the most egregious threat and therefore pouring all your resources and attention into stopping them. Is this the death of the Daesh first policy? Are we seeing the United States now getting more involved with a multiplicity of factors and players here, where there's a triage of people they have to go after in a place like Syria?
Well, certainly it complicates things. As you pointed out, ISIS has been the priority. We continue to want to put pressure on them, so that has to be addressed. We have to work with Russia, regardless of whether we hold them responsible for what happened. This is something that's going to require Russia and the United States finding a way together to address both the ISIS situation as well as the chemical attacks. So there are a lot of things going on now,
right.
And of course complicating all of this is the multiplicity of actors on the ground, whether it's the rebel forces, Hezbollah, or others. So it's going to be a difficult problem to navigate.
Okay, so Sergei Markov, Walter Given saying the United States still has to work with Russia as it moves forward. Does Russia now want to work with the United States after what they just did?
Frankly speaking, we didn't see a dramatic change in United States foreign policy on the Syria. We believe that such aviation strike was mostly targeted against United States Congress. And it first of all has domestic politics roots, because Donald Trump has very big problems in his domestic politics. His popularity dropped down, and Donald Trump wants to increase his political support inside United States. But at the same time, from military point of view, the impact of such 89 Tomahawks was absolutely zero if you look at the fields in Syria. Almost zero military results. And we probably will see only this, some kind of, advertising of the how Donald Trump is strong, right, and has a political will.
Let me pose this to
so much.
I want to ask you about chemical weapons in a moment, but let me pose the domestic angle to Walter Given. Walter Given, was this all for domestic consumption? I mean, we even saw liberal TV talk show hosts, Brian Williams, talking about how beautiful those missiles were. I mean, this was bizarre to see so many Americans supporting President Donald Trump now, particularly those who were actively opposed to him. So was this maybe just a cynical domestic ploy from Trump to boost his numbers?
I don't think it's a cynical domestic ploy to boost the numbers at all. I've served with General McMaster since we were captains. I know that options were laid out in a serious manner and that this responsibility was taken very seriously as to what the United States' responsibilities were to act in this particular case with the use of chemical weapons in a way that we haven't seen in a very long time, and we certainly hope that we wouldn't see. So I think, although you'll see some divisions in American public opinion, I think in general Americans will unite around the interest of the United States in this particular use of force.
Sergei Markov, is Russia responsible for not disarming Assad? They were supposed to be the key player here. Rex Tillerson, the US Secretary of State, called Russia at the very least incompetent for allowing Syria to hold on to chemical weapons, yet he's still gassing his people with sarin from the air. Is Russia responsible?
Russia responsible for disarming Bashar Assad.
So why is he dropping sarin on his people?
Yeah, we believe that this provocation had been organized by Jabhat al-Nusra. Oh, no. That's why Russia immediately suggested to have international investigation of what really happened in those poor city where almost 100 people have been killed by these chemical weapons. And our partners, the United States, strongly deny to have any investigations. And I think they're responsible for the Jabhat al-Nusra next repeating of provocation. And can you ask yourself, I think our partner, our colleague has some kind of logic. Can you ask yourself, what reason Bashar Assad to use chemical weapons just 3 days after representative of White House told that now they're changing their policy, already not will insist on the removing of Bashar Assad.
Okay.
And after this,
many would say,
in 3 days,
I don't want to go back and forth. Sure, I don't want to go back and forth. Many would say, hey, you know what? Because he can, and because 6 years on, 400,000 people are dead, we just don't know. It's hard to psychoanalyze some mindsets, but this is where we are. I don't want to go back and forth over this because it's a rabbit hole I've gone down before. I want to broaden this out now. Let's look at some of the international reaction and the international ramifications. Bear with us, gentlemen. Here's Sandra Gottman with more.
The U.S.'s decision to strike a Syrian airbase after the gas attack drew praise and condemnation from predictable corners. The dividing line clearly drawn between Bashar al-Assad's allies and opponents. France, Italy, and Germany declared joint support.
Der Vereinigten Staaten von Amerika ist angesichts der Dimension der Kriegsverbrechen, angesichts des Leids der unschuldigen Menschen und angesichts der Blockade im UN-Sicherheitsrat nachvollziehbar.
Even old foes, Saudi Arabia and Israel, agreed the move showed resolve and forceful action in Syria. But to the Syrian regime and its allies, the U.S.'s unilateral move violated their sovereignty.
This aggression is against the sovereignty and against international law and against a country that is a member of the United Nations. But this is not surprising. All the stories before the invasion of Iraq proved to be absolutely false.
همه تروریست‌های سوریه از این حمله آمریکا جشن گرفتن و اظهار خوشحالی کردند. اگر راست میگفتید چرا در اولین اقدامتون به تروریست‌ها کمک کردید؟
There's also been fallout between the U.S. and Russia. The Kremlin froze military cooperation with the U.S. ahead of a visit by Secretary of State Rex Tillerson to Moscow this week. The question now is whether the American reaction to the regime's chemical attacks will sink or drive a political solution to Syria's war. Sandra Gottman, The Newsmakers.
Yahya Al-Aridi, let's split this up into two teams, I guess. On the one hand, you have the Syrian regime, backed by Russia, backed by Iran. On the other hand, you have the opposition, the rebels. You have countries such as the Gulf countries, Turkey, the United States, and so on. Who's winning right now?
Well, I can tell you about the losers. The main loser of all this thing is the Syrian people, who have been suffering for 6 years. 500,000 are killed, and half of the country is destroyed, half of the people are being displaced, ethnic cleansing is taking place, and the world is watching. Now, I think President Trump just came out of realism, just seeing these things consciously and realistically and with conscience.
Can you really trust this man? I want to call up one of his tweets from 2013. He said, "Don't attack Syria, an attack that will bring nothing but trouble for the US. Focus on making our country strong and great again." That was from 2013. What if he changes his mind tomorrow?
I understand. No, it's not a matter of changing your mind tomorrow, and it's not a matter of seasonal things happening. Actually, when you see these atrocities, when we understand that the United States is built on institutions, and he has those files on his desk, and he knows now the atrocities that have been taking place. It was a campaign with so many multi-issues, and now he is focusing on this particular issue that has been nagging on and dragging on for 6 years. Now he knows that there is a dictatorship and there is somebody who is just turning a blind eye to all the people's misery over there. And now there's a wake-up of conscience on the part of the world, and he is realizing it through this move. And I think it's going to be followed up by certain things that are to take place in order to just not free Syria, but at least to put Syrian people on the road to coming back to life.
Followed up by certain things. Rob Maness, does that mean the United States getting drawn in, sucked into a proper war, for want of a better word, in Syria, and maybe it becoming a terrible quagmire?
Oh, I absolutely think so. You know, the enemy always gets a vote, and since the United States, it's poked its finger into the Syrian conflict and its own civil war. We are getting distracted from our war against the Islamic State, even though that war is inside Syria proper. And I'm very concerned that the follow-on actions of Russia, Iran, and the Syrians themselves will draw the United States into this war. Nobody thinks that this was an unserious decision, but why would the President of the United States make a decision like this based on intelligence on the ground in Syria that he says is so faulty we can't have refugees from Syria come to the United States? It makes no sense whatsoever for the United States to have taken this action and distracted itself from the overall goal, which is to eliminate the Islamic State from the face of the earth, which is what the goal of the coalition it's leading in the Kurdish area, in Syria, in northern Iraq, and in parts of Turkey.
Sergei Markov, are we now closer to Russia and the United States possibly getting involved in a conflict, and everybody's afraid of that?
We don't know for sure. And the problem which we have, Russia and other countries has, that we don't know what foreign policy of the United States is. And who is responsible for foreign policy? We see Rex Tillerson, who is almost isolated there. We see Michael Pence, Jared Kushner, then some Mattis, defense minister, and some other people. And we think that the problem is that United States has no clear foreign policy. And we cannot say that it changed because it's impossible to change nothing.
Right.
And in contradiction is the United States still #1 superpower in the world, and too many countries in conflict depend on them, and United States don't know what they're going to do.
Okay, so let's pose that because we're running out of time. Let's pose that to Walter Given, and I'll make this the final word. Does the man have a point, given that here's a president again, and I'm sorry to go back to his personality, but you know this is like manna from heaven, especially with his tweets. Here's a man who publicly defended Saddam Hussein, and he said, hey, everybody went crazy when Saddam threw a little gas on his people. Now he's got the moral posturing, and he's saying he's defending the Syrian children. Does Sergei Markov have a point that nobody actually knows what the policy is, and that makes it all the more unpredictable?
Well, I think the point is this is a complicated situation that is going to require a lot of skill to navigate. I think there are times that bring everything into clarity. This was a moral moment that had a clarity to it that action was required. Now, that doesn't diminish the challenge of the follow-up actions or the consequences that are particularly there, especially the risk of escalation. So it is going to take a very measured and deliberate response as we navigate this, and I think the administration will find out a lot about itself as it does it.
Okay, gentlemen, it's been a pleasure talking to all of you. Major General Walter D. Given, Colonel Rob Maness, Yahya Al-Aridi, and Sergei Markov, thanks so much for joining us. And that's all for this edition of the Newsmakers with me, Imran Garda. Thank you for watching. Bye-bye.